it's a clear benchmark to our allies around the world that they need to step up as well. I mean, if all NATO allies got to 2.5% or more, that would be an extra £140 billion. Would send a message not only to our adversaries, but also to whatever the new, whoever the new president is in the US, or the continuation of President Biden, that we are prepared to step up.
The Defence Secretary Grant Shapps told us that he didn't want 3% of GDP of the budget to spend on the military because he wouldn't be able to spend it on British-made weapons and equipment. He'd have to go abroad and spend it and buy from other people. That's an example of the difficulties faced by whoever is in charge over the next few years. How do they step up military spending in a way that doesn't waste money on things that don't work, aren't really needed, or help other countries more than this one? Let's get an insight into that from Sir Jeremy Quin, Defence Committee Chair and former Minister of State in the Ministry of Defence. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you make then of what Grant Shapps is saying, that 2.5 is the right number, but 3% is not?
Well, I think if you're the Defence Secretary, you argue hard for what you can get, and you then make best use of the resources that are made available to you. I've got absolutely no doubt that that 2.5% commitment is what's needed. Of course, I can't believe anyone would actually say no to more resources for defence, but 2.5% is a very significant increase. 75 billion additional resources over the next 6 years makes a huge contribution. And what's important about it is, with the 75th anniversary of NATO celebrations coming up this summer in Washington, it's a clear benchmark to our allies around the world that they need to step up as well. I mean, if all NATO allies got to 2.5% or more, that would be an extra £140 billion. Would send a message not only to our adversaries, but also to whatever the new, whoever the new president is in the US, or the continuation of President Biden, that we are prepared to step up.
That's hope, though, isn't it, over anything else? Because I think it's something like 19 of the member states don't pay that particular amount. Do you think that? Do you actually think it will make a difference if we do?
I do. The reason being that when we started off this process in Wales 10 years ago, there was a NATO conference which the UK hosted in Wales. At that point, we had to get to 2%. And at that point, there were only 4 of us, including the UK, who were hitting the 2% target. That's now 11. Amongst those who are only now hitting 2% are France and Germany. They're not quite there yet, but they're nearly there. I think by again setting out a benchmark and saying this is where you should be in order to support our requirements as an alliance, that will send a powerful message, and is right to do it.
Let's talk about procurement, because there are some people who will argue, yes, we need to spend money to make ourselves safer. Other people say, no, we need to spend money on other things like transport, on the NHS, on potholes, whatever it might be. But if we are going to spend this money, how secure are we knowing that it is going to be used properly? There have been problems. There was the MOD report saying that there were systemic and institutional failures in how we buy weapons and equipment, procurement, in other words.
Defence procurement has been an issue for as long as defence spending has existed. It's never easy to spend money, and it gets harder the more technological defence becomes. So it's always difficult ground, but it's important we get it right. The government has done some really good initiatives. They've been of long gestation, but they've been announced now, and they are exactly what we need to be doing in order to ensure that we get the right military kit. So that includes ensuring that we go for the very best capability we can, and we get it into service. Too often we are waiting for absolute perfection in our military kit before putting it onto the front line. That doesn't work anymore. We need to ensure that we get appropriate kit onto the front line, and then we upgrade it over time. And that's good news for defence. It means we get the kit earlier. It's also good news for British industry, because it means that they know there's going to be a drumbeat of orders, and they can meet that challenge. And with the knowledge that this investment's coming into defence, they will absolutely be upping their capital investment and upping their R&D, which is what we need.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you say that we can't always wait on perfection. Most people would agree with that, and Grant Shapps said the same thing. But if you look at the Ajax tank, I know this example is always used, isn't it? 4 billion, more than 4 billion spent on that, yet only 44 of them were delivered to the army because the early versions were just too noisy to use.
What happened with Ajax is a classic case, and this is actually an example of how complex it can be in defence procurement. One of the reasons why Ajax was delayed is that they changed the specification. They changed the specification for good reason, which was they had learnings from Afghanistan. They increased the amount of armour on Ajax to ensure that our troops were more safe and secure, and that was one of the factors that led to a delay in Ajax. But the Ministry of Defence is still holding Ajax to General Dynamics to account. It's still getting those Ajax tanks in operation. I believe they are now being delivered. And when they are on the front line, they will be a significant upgrade to the resources available to the army.
Okay, I want to ask you finally about recruitment, actually, because the Navy's had to decommission some ships because it couldn't get the sailors. So what does that money mean? The money we're talking about today, the 75 billion, what does that mean in terms of, in relation to recruitment?
It's be positive. I mean, to recap, this is a positive message in terms of our NATO allies. It's a positive message in terms of the message that it sends to our adversaries and our determination to defend this country. It's a positive message to British industry, saying up your game, up your R&D, increase your capital expenditure. For anybody considering a career in the services, they know that there are now more resources going in to support our armed forces to ensure that they will have the kind of careers that they expect when they sign up, whether that's in the Royal Navy, the Army, or the Air Force. So this does better underpins the defence equipment plan. So that's the modernisation of the Army and further improvements to the Royal Navy, and also the new combat air system for the Royal Air Force, all of which required funding. And this will go a long way towards ensuring that those needs are met.
Okay, Jeremy Quin, thank you. Defence Committee Chair and former Minister of State in the Ministry of Defence.
Loads of views on this, actually. And there is a split. I think we're probably, Times Radio listeners thus far in touch with us are more supportive than not. But Gina makes a point, which is sort of the scepticism about Putin. He can't throw enough cannon fodder to even get through the quagmire in eastern Ukraine. I know our government needs to whip up the crowd for the defence spending, but please, some grown-up talk. If not, crying wolf will defeat their argument to all our cost, as it did with Iraq's non-existent nuclear weapons. But Catherine says, a few years ago, before Putin invaded Ukraine, I'd have said no to wanting defence spending increased. I'd probably been up for strapping Trident. Today, though, I support spending more and feel the world is a much more unstable place, and defence of the realm is the priority. So when Ben Wallace was stepping down as Defence Secretary last summer, he said he'd be prepared to speak out from the back benches if Rishi Sunak didn't stick to his promise to increase military spending to 2.5% of GDP. He no longer needs to get vocal because it's happened. What does he make of what's happened? Ben joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Are you happy?
Yeah, look, I am pleased. I'd started the role of Defence Secretary always determined that we were going to move defence away from being a sort of government discretionary spend that was stuck on the end, which had been happening for the last sort of 20 years under both Labour and the Conservative, back into the core of the government. And that was because, as Security Minister, I'd seen the growing threats to this country, both at home and abroad. And I felt, it is threat that should ultimately determine what we spend on defence and security. It's not, I know we have the economic conditions line that's often delivered, but ultimately, surely, we need to step up when there's a threat to us, and we need to invest. And you can't do that at last minute. You have to do that over a number of years. So I'm delighted because it continues the increased spending that I got. And, I had been pretty critical even of my own government that both Conservatives and the Labour Party had for about 30 years hollowed out defence, certainly for the last 20 years, and never really invested properly. And so in 2019 and then 2020, I got extra £24 billion real money, and we started to turn that corner and move above 2%. So I am pleased. It's the right thing to do. And I think it actually also just reflects the different styles between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. Rishi, I know how he works, and he would have been absolutely meticulous before he wanted to announce it. He would have made sure that whatever priorities he's deprioritised in an upcoming manifesto, he would have done so. Whereas when I was working with Boris and I would probably announce something and then go and have a fight with the Treasury to try and get it. So the two different methods, but ultimately we're in the right place.
But the deprioritisation is right, isn't it? I mean, I know you say that this shouldn't be an economic argument because the defence of the realm is the most important, but that's how the Treasury works. It is a zero-sum equation. You spend an extra 75 billion here, you've got to take 75 billion from there. What would you be happy seeing cut in order to pay for this?
Well, Stig, I'm leaving Parliament. The job of the leader of the Tory party, or any leader, is to lead is to choose, and ultimately, I think speculation of what is not really going to help the picture. I am no longer in charge of any departmental budget, having to make that decision.
But if they said to you, we're going to spend
you're right. It's about deprioritisation, or potentially, are we going to have enough tax receipts, etc., to deal with it? And I think what is absolutely honest is defence as a priority has moved up the list. It's really important. But I think we could also put it in perspective. It's a lot of money to everybody, 76 billion. But if I were to compare the health budget, the health and social care budget, in cash terms, since 2010, we are now spending £100 billion a year more than we did in 2010. And in real terms, so if you take into inflation, we're spending £54 billion more in 1 year on the NHS and the health and social care. So a lot of parts of government have had huge amounts of money over the last 14 years. I suspect that they'll continue to do so. But ultimately, defence hadn't, and I think that's the right thing.
And are you comfortable with the idea, Ben? I mean, you might not want to answer this question, but as you are leaving Parliament, so maybe you can answer it. If they actually said, you know what, we have spent an awful lot more on the NHS, we are continuing to spend an awful lot of money on the NHS, but we are going to take some money that we had earmarked for the NHS and spend it on defence, would you be comfortable with that?
Well, so this is not me speaking as either the Conservative Party or anything. But look, over the years, many years, I've watched a growing investment in health. It does fantastic work for us all. I think we've literally now topped out almost in Europe. But I've also not seen a health service that delivers the same productivity as the rest of Europe. And I think, even Wes Streeting in the Labour Party is starting to be very vocal about reforms that need to happen. Your own Times Commission recognises that. So, look, I'm comfortable that no department in government should ever get an endless blank cheque. Unless it produces better productivity or better outcomes. Now, the NHS does do an amazing job, and it might not be the NHS that loses the money. It might be, who knows, it might be something else across the vast £1 trillion budget that is the government. Remember, that's how big it is, £1,000 million. £1 million, no, £1,000 million. What is a modern trillion? It's £1 million, isn't it? £1 million.
Come on.
No, billions are different. Some describe a billion as different. So. Anyhow, it's a lot of money, and I think ultimately that is for the leaders of the future, and that is for Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer to answer their questions.
You make a good point about productivity and getting bang for your buck effectively. And there is a concern, Ben Wallace, you'll be aware of this. I don't know how much you want to defend your former colleagues in the Ministry of Defence, but there is an argument that Ministry of Defence spending over the last 20 years has been disgraceful. Its procurement has been wasteful. We've spent billions on a tank system like Ajax that never actually produced anything. A lot of money goes in one end and not a lot of stuff comes out. And that's a worry for people, that if we're going to spend an extra 75 billion, they don't trust your former department to spend it properly.
Well, look, I'm glad you pointed out the Ajax, because the Ajax didn't cost us any extra money at all.
Well, it must have cost something.
No, nothing extra, and now it is doing incredibly good job and working very well.
So it's a success.
Well, it's late, but it's a success, right? And I was determined to either fix it or cancel it when I took over the job, because it had been lurking around. It was originally decided by Labour that they were going to buy this, and you're absolutely right. There are a lot of stories, but when you actually drill into them anecdotally, you discover the facts don't actually match. So at any one time, Defence Equipment and Support, that's the agency, manages about 2,500 contracts and 550 programmes, and they deliver 98% of key user requirements and 89% of contractual milestones. We get into trouble with our defence programmes when they are very big and very exquisite, and if they're often international, because then you lose cost controls.
So you have confidence, but you have confidence.
I have confidence, and James Cartledge, the Defence Procurement Minister, has done a really excellent reform recently. I think we're definitely on the way to make sure your money is better spent. But also there are always questions for each service about, are you going to fight yesterday's battles or tomorrow's war? And that's why we did a defence review and another review, a refresh of it, I would also urge Labour not to indulge itself in another defence review, because that is what the Treasury loves, and it just is another 2-year delay.
You think it's an excuse for a review is an excuse to delay?
Well, you don't have to know the future battlefield. You know, those defence reviews aren't written by politicians; they're written by the experts. We've only had one a couple of years ago, and what I can tell you this as a backbencher now, but what happens is the Treasury loves to insert itself in the room, and if you think about how government, whoever is the next government, they will set out another 3-year spending plan at their first budget. If you're busy doing a defence review, you won't be in that long-term plan. Yeah. And when you come knocking on the door to the Treasury the following year and say, oh, look, we've got a plan for defence, you know, Rachel Reeves or Jeremy Hunt will say, well, you're going to have to wait to the next defence review because we're not going to take from other departments now. We won't open the envelope. So I would recommend that Labour get on board with this. And let's again put it in perspective. You know, I served in North Germany just in 1991, at the end of the Cold War. We still had a health service. We still had education. We still had all these things. And we were spending nearly 4% of GDP. You know, it doesn't mean to say that the rest of government gets cancelled because you want to invest in your defence and security. And with defence and security, you get stability. And with stability, you get a growing economy and investment, so you get better tax receipts. And if people don't think it matters, many of those poor, tragic people trying to cross the channel every day are fleeing war and instability. And if we want to deal with some of that upstream, then we have to deal with stability and war in other countries to stop these migrant flows as well.
Ben Wallace, good to speak to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
That's Ben Wallace there, the former Defence Secretary, articulating the need government doesn't get cancelled if you spend more money on defence. Is that what you want to hear from the government?